Hey, everybody. Today we are joined by Justin, our mentor from JA Digitizing Studios. I'm Jeff Fuller from Fuller Embroidery Works. We have Dustin from Lilac City Stitches, and we have Matt Enderly from Patch Phrase. And surprise, because we have been talking for a little bit and thought we hit the start button, but apparently we didn't. So we're just rolling with it right now. But Justin, you guys have kind of talked about this a little bit already, so let's talk about it again, I guess.
So take two.
Take two.
Take two.
Take two. So Dustin had sent me a design that he was working on and digitizing some lettering along with a design, and I thought it'd be a good opportunity for us to kind of show the communication between an embroiderer and a digitizer, trying to get to that level ground of where it's going to be work best for the end user. And, of course, being the digitizer, trying to get it to make sure that it's going to be the most efficient running design, cleanest looking design, and whatnot. So it's a good opportunity to just kind of go back and forth and kind of show that communication. Like I said, the first time around, a lot of this is done nowadays, via email or messaging, or every once in a while I'll actually get a phone call from a customer, but this is the type of stuff that goes back and forth between an embroiderer and digitizer, trying to get that design to where it needs to be. So
yeah, and I think too, with kind of a fresh year, I think it's always kind of good to kind of recap on the communication that needs to. And I guess I'm saying this as an embroiderer that does send work in. I'm learning to digitize, but does send most of my work in to get professionally digitized, and the communication. Cough twice. I can see it. Do you need me to cough? Sorry for the interruption. So just kind of recap and just understand, coming from professional digitizers, what users like myself need to communicate when sending any kind of artwork in to get digitized.
Right. And yeah, and as far as if you are an embroiderer, or even just trying to get into the digitizing field, I think the best way to kind of building those stepping stones of learning your craft is to kind of team up with a professional digitizer that does good work, and kind of watch how their designs run, ask questions if you're not understanding why they did something a certain way. A lot of times, I got my start as a working at an embroidery company, and working with a digitizer that was a really, really good digitizer. And I asked questions, and I saw his designs run, and kind of just started doing it myself, and applying those things that I saw that he was doing in order to kind of create my own style, and trials and tribulations of what works and what doesn't work over the years, to keep on learning and seeing how to make that embroidery look as good as possible. So we have a design. So first off, I'm going to kind of run through the design and ask a few questions that I saw right off the bat.
Hey, Justin, while you're pulling that up, before you get too far, let's go ahead and grab some comments here. We have Ramona saying good evening. We have Caleb from Washington State. Letty from Ohio, if I remember right. We have Jerry Lee from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Amy, aloha. She's in Hawaii. I feel bad for her. She's in Hawaii. And we have Bevy Jean. Good evening, everyone. Hello, Bevy Jean. And that's I'm caught up on comments now. Sorry to interrupt you, Justin.
Oh, no problem. So just when I see a design, when a design comes in from a customer, there's a couple of things that my eyes go to right off the bat, and I'm going to question it if they're on my order form that I ask for a size, ask what kind of garment's going on, the placement. So if someone says, I want this 5 inches tall, but I want it on a hat, something that's not jiving there. But pulling up this design, and being that it's something you already started, the bottom lettering is the thing that I'm going to kind of zero in on and kind of see, hey, let's see if there's an adjustment that we can make as far as like the size of the design, because there's quite a bit of wording right now. And if I'm not mistaken, let me grab the file here. It's just over 2.5 inches wide, almost 2.6 inches wide. So with that lettering, and if I go to the size of the letter, that's only 3 millimeters tall. So right off the bat, I know it's going to cause some issues, the size of that text. So there's a couple different things that I would come back to the customer and say, hey, do we have room to make this, overall bigger, the whole design bigger? So what is this going on, Dustin?
This is actually going on hats. So it is a hat design. Now, I also would attempt to also change sizing a little bit for left chest logo as well. And I was putting on beanies as well, but more focus on hats.
So with hats, depending on what machine you have, typically hats range from a max of 2.25 to 2.5 inches tall is your max. I usually go from there because that's kind of your limit as far as hats is usually the height. This logo being wider than it is tall, you have a little bit more room to kind of cover the hat area and get some size on the design that you need for that bottom text. So right now, with it being only just over 2.5 inches wide, that puts it at 1.3 tall. So we definitely have a lot more room to work with. But like you said, if it is going on a couple of different applications, some people don't mind that a hat's a little bit bigger than the left chest. Some people want to match the exact size. So again, this being that you're the kind of the middleman, this is communication that I'm hoping that my customers are helping with their end customer before it comes to me. So you have all the information. And the more and more that whether you're digitizing yourself or you're learning from your digitizer what kind of questions that need to be asked, as an embroiderer, you're going to know what to ask before you even send it to your digitizer. And that way you have all the information of, they're willing to omit small text if need be, if there's really no way that it can work. Make the overall size of the design bigger, make just the bottom lettering bigger. These are the types of things that I would ask right off the bat, seeing this, and if you had requested this being the size that it is now. Those are the type of things that I'd go back to you and say, hey, you're not going to get a quality design. You're not going to get, lettering that's really legible. You're not going to have that, 3 to 6 feet rule of being able to read the design. Yeah. So I ask you, like you said, if you have room to make the design bigger, then right off the bat, I say that's going to solve a lot of the problems that I see with working with this design.
Okay.
So what I would do is, given that left chests typically are, and something that's a little bit wider than it is tall, left chests are typically 3 to 4 inches wide at the very most. I'd say 3 inches is the most average size of a left chest design. One that's shaped like this, that's wider than it is tall. So I would say if we're let's go ahead and just approach this that it's going on a hat. I would say let's go ahead and take it up to 4 inches wide. If my computer wants to cooperate.
While your computer's cooperating, we'll go
Yeah.
ahead and pull up. We have Barb here. Hello. Anthony from Indiana. Hello. We have Sheila. Hey, guys, watching from San Antonio, Texas. Awesome. We have Crystal. Justin knows Crystal.
Hi, Crystal.
We have Randall. Hello. Barb, again, hello. Randall, is this considered a digitizing 911? We're doing them in this format? That's awesome. Not quite sure on that one yet. We'll pin a note in that and revisit it later. We have Bill here checking in. Hello. We have Suzanne. Hello from Newport, Rhode Island. And we have Jennifer. Hello from Iowa. And I'll be quiet again because it looks like you got it to scale up.
Yeah. So I guess we can look at it as a live digitizing 911. So at this point, going down back to that text, just kind of seeing what size that we're at. I always like to look these in millimeters because embroidery tends to be in millimeters as far as everything is measurements. So that now puts it at 4.75, just under 5 millimeters, which is typically the kind of the minimum size that designs everybody tends to try to stay to. So you have nice, clean lettering. So I guess I'll go ahead and run through the few things that I'm seeing in the design that now that I know that it's for a hat, that I'm gonna, kind of like the things that I run through in my brain that needs to be in the design in order for it to work on a hat. So of course, first thing is going to be bottom up. You did do the lettering first, so you are doing the most bottom element. One thing also I noticed is you are using a true type font. The difference between the stock lettering that you find in pretty much any software, but this one being Wacom, those are hand digitized by the creators of the software in order to work for embroidery. So the way the corners are done, you're hoping that the creator of whatever software you're using has, the capabilities of digitizing good lettering, which pretty much all the major software out there that I've used.
Justin,
yeah,
we have a couple of questions for you actually, so I'm going to jump them in here. Ramona asks, do you have a size guideline for small text on hats? For example, I prefer to do a 7 millimeter text, but many clients want to do a 5 millimeter and shorter, more characters across the front.
So I tend to try to stay at 5 millimeters minimum, which right now, just by scaling it up, it put it at 4.75, but I'm going to show a couple of tricks to get that up to 5 millimeters without stretching and distorting, without making the lettering, the proportion from the lettering to the design itself. You could just grab bottom lettering, make it as big as you need to, but sometimes the proportion of the bottom lettering or the tagline to the actual logo itself is a little off if you just start grabbing one thing and scaling it and not the other. But there's some tricks with lettering that I've learned, especially on hats, where you kind of fudge spacing and a little bit of a height, a little bit of the width. So again, you're not just dragging and distorting the shape of the lettering itself too much in one direction.
All right, and then we have one more question. It's from Caleb here. Not sure what type of fabric you're going to be using. Is there a good general type to request for?
Small lettering, I think the most basic font that you can choose, like an Arial block or a Helvetica block, is definitely your best bet. Having really thin serif fonts on small lettering can be a little bit iffy at times. Something that's really intricate, like some scripts that have a lot of loops to them and a lot of small areas, you don't want to do small lettering. So the basic and the boldest font that you can use to kind of just have really straight lines in real basic areas, that's not gonna fight against you when you're working with a small font.
All right, and now we go into the Jeff's commercial. If you'd like to learn more about text and text in general, Justin did an excellent webinar on text. What was it, a month ago? A little less than that, right? Mm-hmm. And you can follow it here at the link, embnerd.com/text talk, where he goes over a lot of the stuff that he's going to be talking about tonight and even more. So if you're wanting to find out more about how to make your text pop, then I highly recommend going to this webinar. I sat through it and watched it, and there's a lot of information. Justin does a really good job and puts a lot of work into them. So
Thank you, Jeff.
That's I guess it's not my self-plug, right? If I'm plugging you, it's not self-promotion.
No.
So, all right. And then Ramona asks, while I've got you, and do you digitize for a center hat seam, not knowing if it'll be used on a 6-panel now or later?
Yeah, I always digitize for a 6-panel. because the way I look at it is if it goes on a five panel, it's still going to work. So back to the lettering. So the main thing that I see going back to the difference between a stock font that's a stock font from the software and pretty much, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, since you have a kabillion softwares, Wilcom does allow you to grab true type fonts that are on your PC or on your Mac and convert them to stitches in a stitch file. Most of the major softwares out there have this function now. Is that correct, Jeff?
Yeah, I would say most of them do. One of the disadvantages of it that I see is it seems like every time you type out your lettering and you scale it, it auto digitizes it as you do it on the fly. Mm-hmm. So from what I see, if you make a change to a letter to try and make it better, you cannot retain that change the next time you go to type it in, which is why, digitized fonts are better because they have all of those changes already in them. And if you need to add a change to it, you can save it as a user refined letter, and you can make changes to it again if you need to, which is a big plus. If you don't have to keep, if it's a R or a W, you don't have to continually edit that every time you type out the R or the W.
Right. So the main things that I'm seeing using this true type font are the computer is going to make its decisions for whatever reason. It's almost like Jeff just said. It's almost like auto digitizing. These softwares that have these auto digitizers, whatever the programming may be, the computer is going to try to pick the stitch type, the stitch direction, how it turns, and it doesn't always work out to your advantage. So kind of looking at this W here, if you see how it actually turns these, and again, you're zoomed into a sub 5mm letter, it actually is trying to turn these corners instead of capping those and keeping that stitch direction the way it's supposed to be, as if you're hand digitizing or using one of the Wilcom fonts. Things like it doesn't compensate for the overlap of the leg of the R here when it comes down to the closest point connection. Another thing I see with the stitch directions, it's turning these corners rather sharp. So instead of having a nice consistent thickness to that satin, it tries to come around that curve. It flattens out those angles quite steep. So these are areas that are gonna fight against you when you're trying to get that nice clean lettering that you're looking for with small lettering. So those are the type of things that you really need to be aware of if you are using a true type font. Now, that's not to say that you can never use a true type font. You may luck out where all these things are, the computer calculates them correctly and they work out fine. More times than not, it doesn't. Another thing too is if it is a font, say, where your artwork isn't very clean and it's a font you have on your computer, a lot of times I'll use that font just to bring in something that's clean on my screen, use that as kind of my template, and just redigitize the proper way over that font. So that's another benefit of having that true type font function is just something you can bring into the software that is a clean image for you to use as a template. Okay. Any other questions there, Jeff?
Not that I see yet, but if you do have questions, please drop them in the comments and we will do our best to pull them up for you guys.
Okay, so let me ask you, Dustin, let me pull up. See, for instance, this lettering here, I don't know why my computer's acting so slow tonight. This lettering here on the artwork is pretty pixelated. So
yeah. I didn't have an actual true vector file where I could get the clarity out of it. It was more of a screenshot. So I was just trying to do my best to band-aid the font.
Gotcha.
So
given that, I'm just for sake of time, I'm going to kind of assume and go along with things like these are things you discuss with your customer. The fact that you're using a stock font and they're okay with it, you can kind of see that it is pretty much a real similar to a basic block font as far as the artwork for what you can see. It's not something that's real stylized, that you're picking an Arial block that looks nothing like it, and they're going to come back to you and say, that's not my logo. But given that we've established that we're using a stock font is fine. So what I would do is, since this is kind of a basic block, I would definitely go to one of the Wacom fonts, which are going to be the first fonts on your list, represented by the little red stitches to the left of them. Those are all the Wacom stock fonts. And anytime I use a stock font, or stock block, I usually use block 2. I just found that it's kind of the run of the mill.
So now I'm gonna throw something at you here, Justin.
All right.
At what point would you consider moving from block 2 to small block 2?
I honestly don't like the small fonts. They do some.
I love the air quotes.
Wacom has a couple of different fonts of kind of the real run of the mill, most popular fonts, Times Roman, Block, all these things. They have a small version. I've just found that, like you said, scaling them sometimes, there's some letters that do some really weird stuff. I end up having to go in there and edit more of the smaller fonts than I do with the regular fonts. But that's just me. Got it, Jeff?
Yeah, no, I was just curious because you're right around, 5 millimeters tall?
Yes, but this is where
the magic comes out.
You can make some adjustments, especially to lettering and spacing and whatnot. That's going to benefit you in the embroidery and digitizing side. And I would say 99% of the time that customer is not going to see the adjustments that you make to text. So,
got it.
One of the things when I'm trying to, of course, easiest way of doing it is like, well, I'm just going to make this 4.5 inches wide and just drag it to the height that I need, and voila, there's the size that you need. But now you just distorted the logo and made the bottom text larger than the top portion, and you're distorting the proportions of the design. So going back to trying to keep it as close as possible, a couple things that I use to try to make sure that I'm not extending that width, the overall width of the lettering, is, for one, you do have the width here at over 100%. So right there, kind of pulled it in. So we have a little bit more room to scale it up. I also go down to word spacing. The default's at 60% for some reason, which to me, I think those words are spaced quite a bit. You can knock that down to 25%, which again, pulls that lettering in. It's a little bit closer to the proportions of the actual artwork, but you're not distorting the height of the lettering where it's stretched out really, really tall. Another thing you'll want to go to is the sequence down here, and you can set it to center out. So for a hat, you always want to do center out, bottom up. So you've started with the text, so you got the bottom up, the center out. Since you are using the stock font, that's how you tell it to, it's going to start probably on the I or the R. Let's see. It starts on the R, works its way right. Or works its way left and then comes back and does the right.
Which I would assume either way, either direction that you're moving on, being a cap logo, bottom to top, center out. I'm assuming it doesn't matter whether it goes center left or center right, as long as it does one or the other, just because of the cupping of a hat.
Correct.
So it can go either way.
Correct. The only time I'm concerned when it's on a hat and you're doing a hat panel like this here.
Yeah.
I tend to go from the center side. So if you're doing it on the left panel, you're going to work your way to the right.
Okay.
depending on what side of the panel that you're doing. So that's the only time that it's not necessarily center of the logo, but you're kind of working the center of the hat out.
Okay.
All right. So at this point, it's I would say it's closer to the width of the original artwork. It's 5 millimeters tall, so you're not dealing with the sub 5 millimeter lettering. The only other thing that I would kind of pay attention to is, of course, your seam. If you're centering this on a hat, your seam is going to be right at the 0. So you have that edge of that eye, that's going to fall right into that seam if you are working with a 6-panel hat. So you can go in there, and one of the if you go into node edit for Wilcom, you could actually they're going to give you these handles that you could actually move individual letters around, which is it's kind of a neat feature in Wilcom and also in other software. But if you just adjust kind of the spacing and kind of over accentuate that gap between that I and that R. Yeah, if you go into the software and measure between every single letter, it's not going to be consistent. But on a hat, given that space between the hat so it kind of straddles that seam, you're going to get a nice cleaner. You're not going to have one letter falling in there where that I is going to distort every single time. So depending on the hat too, you hear the nightmares of the awful Richardson 112s. You have other hats that have a little bit seam that's a little bit softer, but depending on the hat you're working with, this might be adjustment where you have to, after you run a sample hat, you can say, ooh, this seam's really, really wide, or this seam is whatever it may be. You can make this adjustment so it's a little bit gap. Of course, you don't want to make it where the WI looks like a totally different word than the R. RELESS, but that's adjustment where it's kind of fine tuning where to the eye I don't think the customer's ever going to see, but it's going to make your life a lot easier when it comes to on the machine.
I think with the seam and the gap in the seam, if your letter falls into it, the customer, their eye will be drawn to it immediately every time, because they're seeing that variation between wide letter and then disappeared letter, where if you're if you bump out that spacing a little bit, they're just going to see wide letter, seam, wide letter, and it doesn't really go into their head that, hey, that's bumped out a little wide. Why is it bumped out wide? But you can almost get into how precise your operator is at lining up that seam too.
Yeah.
And even on the flip side, if this was a design where you say like you have 1-inch letters and that eye is falling, the edge of that eye is falling on the seam, but you have a nice bold letter, I'll actually try to see if I could adjust it where that eye is straddling the seam. So you're trying to get that seam dead center of that satin. So now your stitches are going to either side of that seam, and you're not going to have any problem at all with it catching that.
Covering the seam.
You're straddling that seam. So if you have a letter where one vertical leg of that letter, you can adjust it without making it totally off center and kind of straddle that seam. That's best case scenario. But anytime you have that vertical letter where you're sewing right down that seam, you want to either adjust fully over it or kind of bump it away, and that'll just make that, like Jeff said, lettering is one of those things where if there's lettering in the logo, it's the first thing your eye goes to. Right. And if the lettering, you could have the top portion of this logo, so the most beautiful design you've ever seen, and one word on there that looks bad, and your brain gets like, oh, this looks awful. Yeah. So that's one thing that is just, I don't know. Lettering is definitely something that you kind of focus on to make sure you get that crisp, good lettering, and then all the rest of the logo kind of falls into place, in my opinion.
Yep. So I'm going to grab a couple of comments here. We have Impressions Brand. Hello from California. Barb says, I steam my Richardsons, which softens them a tad for embroidering, and I've seen that trick done quite a few times. There's 3 or 4 tricks out there that all of them seem to help a little bit.
Yeah.
We have Natalie. How do I digitize center out on Chroma Inspire? Manually.
Yeah.
Manually digitize every letter, and you're going to be sequencing them center out. So
Yeah, I started with Inspire and figuring out very quickly that everything is manual almost in Inspire.
yeah.
Great,
So you
great to
don't have
learn.
so you don't have that setting, Jeff, where you can just grab stock lettering and tell it center out.
Not in Inspire. So there's three
Yeah.
levels. There's Inspire, Plus, and Lux. And that setting I think jumps in at Plus or maybe even at Lux. So
Gotcha.
they unlock more features the more you pay. So
Yeah.
Gotcha.
But
Okay.
that catches us up there on the comments. I'll go ahead and shut up now for a minute.
All right. So given that you make your adjustments on the lettering, you got your bottom up, you got your center out, you make the adjustments so everything's not sitting right on the seam. Your next step is you have the that center area, which is good that you went to that next area, because again, working center out. The one thing I would do is going back to that term global underlay. Anytime you have, especially a circle, the circle is one of those ones where if you digitize a perfect circle and you don't lay down the proper underlay to really get that backing adhered to the back of that hat to give you some stability, that circle is now going to become an oval, because any stitch direction that you're putting a fill down, the direction that fill's sewing is going to start pushing the hat out that direction. So it's going to turn into an oval. So definitely what I would do is there's a couple ways of laying down global underlay. You could either do it manually with just running stitches. So now I do see that if this is your dead center, I do see that this section doesn't look like it's quite centered. Yeah, let me just put it together and center it mathematically. Okay. So now that we got that centered, there's one way of laying down the global underlay. You can just grab a running stitch tool. Typically, I tend to go a little bit wider as far as stitch length, which is going to be the space between each individual stitch in a running stitch. Typically, I go anywhere from 3 to 4 millimeters. Let's go 3.5. And you don't want to start right on that seam, because putting those lock stitches right in the middle of the seam, you're just asking for thread and needle breaks. So typically I go off one side or the other couple millimeters over, start from the bottom up, and just kind of do a zigzag pattern, which is stabilizing that material. Come around back to the center, work your way out.
And you're just using a simple running stitch, you said?
Yeah, that's one way of doing it. Before the software had a lot of bells and whistles where there's kind of preset underlay stitches, or what do they call it in Wilcom? The square setting, which is basically a fill stitch, but it's a really open zigzag. Here, I'll show you. This way, you'd have to do the shape in, you do a half circle. Let's do that a contrasting color so you can see it. As you can see, it kind of gives you a really open fill.
Okay.
That typically you want to do a perfect 90-degree angle, so it's working its way center out. I think it's just an old school way of, because like I said, a lot of the software didn't have automatic ways of doing a little bit harder way of getting to that automatic underlays or automatic settings. I always did manual stitches, so I tend to just do that. I can control exactly where it's going to sew. there is times where if you use this, depending on if you get the start and stop points just off a little bit, how you can see these travel stitches that the computer is trying to compute. Sometimes it kind of works against you for any reason if it's trying to travel from the bottom. If it's kind of an irregular shape, it may try to go up to the top left corner and start from there and kind of work your way to the bottom side of it. It's less control when you use these automated things as far as the stitch pattern or the stitch direction. So I tend to use the running stitch only because I can tell it, I know I want it to go from point A to point B to point C, and I know exactly where it's going to go. So on a circle or a square, I think that those automated tools work perfectly fine. If you have kind of a weird, say like it's a weird lake or a pool or something like that, where it's kind of got crevices and stuff like that, you don't want to use these automated tools because, like I said, it may start if you may put the start at the bottom center where you want it to start, but it may travel up and to the right to get this small little area and then come back to where you want to start. So you're not really getting that center out stability. So those are the things you got to be aware of when you're using the automated tools in your software.
Okay. So on this, for an example, Justin, you're manually doing a satin run stitch as a global underlay, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you go to fill that area, are you just using your a fill for it, and then you're going to turn off the
automatic
default
underlay?
Yep.
If I know the garment color and you're not doing a light thread on a dark hat, put it this way: if you're doing light thread on a dark hat, I usually tend to leave the underlay on.
Okay.
Because you're going to want that a little bit, that extra layer to make sure that coverage is going to be without really driving up the density on your fill. You're going to want that little extra coverage to make sure that light fill is going to hide that bottom, your garment color. Say like this was royal blue going on a black hat. Not much contrast there. The amount of underlay that I'm using is going to, give it the stability. I don't need that extra coverage underneath. It's going to save you a little bit on stitch count. So it should work out good.
Perfect.
So Justin, I'm going to jump in here for a second. We have Ginger here saying good info on auto versus manual underlay. Suzanne says, I always add a little space near an I, especially when it is near another straight letter like an N, L, on the left side of a B and D, etc. And Barb says, I agree with Justin, as the same concept for seams applies to the heavy-duty Carhartt jackets with the seams down the back.
Yeah.
Now I'm caught up. I'm good.
All right. So not only do I do the center out, I usually come around, especially on a circle, and I do a couple passes around that circle just to really stabilize that hat to the shape that you're wanting to stay at. I also do that with squares because squares on hats tend to flare out or buckle in. Mm-hmm. So you're really wanting to make sure that hat is adhering to that backing, and you're basically making sure that hat's going to have the least amount of shifting of the fabric because you are working with a curved surface. You're trying to establish that shape before you even get to your fill stitch.
Okay.
You also don't want to use really heavy angles on your fills. You don't want to go with an 80-degree fill where it's running from one side of the hat to the other and it's really pushing one direction or left or right. 15, 20 degrees is typically where I go, where you're kind of, even though you have to kind of go left to right technically, if you're going at a 15-degree angle, it's still going from bottom to top of the hat instead of left to right on the hat.
Okay.
So 15, 20 degrees is definitely the range that you want to stay in for your fills. So you're at 15 degrees of that circle, so that's perfect. Let me get the artwork into place here. All right. So next you have the rest of the, I'd say the white areas, the outer circle and the W's. Working with a hat, I tend to, there's a fine line between trying to keep all your colors so you reduce color changes on the design, so your machine's not having to stop and change colors and adding length to your runtime. On hats, it's a little bit different, that I tend to go a little bit more as far as trying to sew one area at a time, especially with things that you're really trying to line up, since you have a double border here. You have the outer white border and the inner blue border. Things like that, where again, when your eyes get to see little imperfections, where if you were to sew that circle and you're really not on, and that other circle is off, a half a millimeter to a millimeter, your eyes get to see that, because you're going to see one side of that circle is 2 millimeters, and the other side of the circle is 4 millimeters or 3 millimeters. It's really going to seem off. So especially when you're working with symmetrical designs, I tend to focus on finishing that portion of the design before I work my way out. So instead of doing that O and going back out and jumping out to do the W and then the other W, now you're basically, that machine has traveled from side to side the extreme width of the design, and you're expecting it to come back to that center and be perfectly registered where that other outline is getting now lined up perfectly. And I'd say 9 times out of 10, it's not going to be. So at this point, I would definitely go with doing your blue fill. I always try to work with kind of center out and kind of work your way up. So I would do the little electrical tower in the middle. I'd come back and do the white outline, and then I'd go ahead and do the blue outline. Double borders like this, I always tend to do the smaller border on top. I know it's not technically center out because you're doing the white first, but when you have that thinner border, you're going to rely on the registration of, if you're to try to do that navy border and such a thin border, and you try to come back and do the white border on top of it, you don't have much play because of that thin border. That if there is any registration issues, you're going to see it more because that blue border is going to disappear. So I tend to do the thinner border on top. So I would do the nice white border, bold border, and navy border on top of that. And I'll go ahead and show you how we do that. You have any questions right now while I'm doing this?
All the questions, Justin, all the questions. So Ginger says 15 to 20 degrees from vertical. I believe that's 15 to 20 degrees from zero, right? So that would be horizontal, 15 degrees up.
Right.
And then that's pretty much all of those questions. I was just going to say that at some point you hit, with the regards to center out and bottom up, at some point you hit where you've anchored everything down, and that becomes a little bit less critical. So like Justin was saying about doing the navy border second, you've already nailed down the center with a run stitch, you've nailed it down with a fill, and you've nailed it down with a white satin border. And so the chances that your registration is going to line up is extremely good, considering that you've already anchored that area really well. You've pushed out and smoothed out the fabric. So there are exceptions to the center out, bottom up. It's just knowing when to spot those and utilize them.
Right. So I'm a big fan of using the shape tools when you are working with perfectly shaped circles and squares and stuff like that. They have the ellipse and the square, making your perfect circle. And you can kind of, since there is in Wilcom, there is an offset tool where you can offset the stitches to the outside or the inside of your plotted line. So I tend to just copy and paste the same circle that I've made, so I know that they're dead center on each other.
So Justin, if you were using, let's say, Wilcom Hatch that doesn't have that offset feature, how would you go about doing that?
Digitizer
That's
manually.
what I'm using.
A couple things. I mean, if the artwork is really, really bad and it's actually hindering me using those nice clean lines to digitize manually, and it's so jagged that, you know, if I'm following that edge of that art and one area is 4 millimeters wide and the next is 3 millimeters wide because the pixels are so bad, that's where you can either go back to the customer and say, hey, you know, kind of that garbage in, garbage out. I need to see your design as clean as possible so I know what I'm digitizing. There may be designs where the circles are supposed to be off and not symmetrical all the way around and not even. And you wouldn't know that if the artwork is so badly pixelated that you don't know what you're looking at. But what I would do is, since I have the capabilities and the know-how of creating art, especially you don't necessarily have to go in and create this whole design again in vector art, but maybe just throw a couple circles down, you know, the size of the circles. So you can have nice clean art where you can bring it into the software yourself and say, hey, you know, the circles are pretty bad. I can identify everything else in the design well enough to digitize off of, but I'm going to throw a couple circles down so I have that nice clean artwork that I can digitize manually. But since I am in Wilcom, and it's so cool, so I tend to, like I said, create a circle, copy and paste it so I know it's dead center on each other. I'll use the offset where I can make one circle go out further. It's going to be the thicker circle. Give it some stability of a nice underlay. And then come back, and you could even offset the inner one to the inside a little bit. That's the wrong direction. So that way I can see now that this actually isn't a perfect circle. It looks like it is wider than it is tall. Yeah, it's slightly, the design itself looks like it's a little bit oblong and not a perfect circle. So you could always just grab it. If you select them both the same at the same time, they're going to scale in the same proportions. Yeah. So that way, looking at the overlap here, I'm going to move this over at there. Since there's that overlap of that outer circle underneath the top circle, the thinner circle, you have that area where it's going to come underneath. So if there is any distortion going on a hat and it pulls one way or another, you're going to have that top stitch go over it, and you're not going to see any differential of that outer white circle, the inner part of that outer white circle. Because if it shifts a little bit, make that line a little bit bolder than you see in the artwork, because that is pretty thin right now. If you were to follow it exactly, it's out. It's over one millimeter, but it's at 1.4. It's still in that range where it's pretty thin, and you're trying to cover another element to make sure that you have that coverage. I'd bump it up a little bit. Again, another adjustment that you're doing in digitizing that your customer's never going to see. You're going to have the pull of the thread anyway. So on screen, it's going to look a lot thicker and a lot bolder than it does actually when it sews out. So those are just adjustments, again, that you're going to learn when you're digitizing. If it looks, what's the rule there, Jeff? If it looks perfect on screen, it's not going to sew perfectly when you get to the machine.
I think that's the mantra, not the rule, but yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, designs sometimes look a little wonky on screen, and especially when you use a PDF as kind of your proof when you send it to a customer. When you do the proper adjustments for height and width of letters and push and pull compensations, that those words are going to look like stairs that are going up and down. And that's the way it should look when you're looking on screen or looking at a printout before you actually do a sew out.
Okay. So on this center part of this logo, you're recommending, like, when you're looking at shapes like a circle like this, you tend to utilize the shape tool as opposed to using digitized block to manually run a fill around it, and because you get the perfect shape by using the tools that are provided by the software, and it's probably a little bit cleaner and a little more accurate.
Right. And a lot of times, especially in circles, because as steady as your hand can be, and this artwork is clean enough where you can follow it, whether you're using column A or column B like Jeff likes, your hand, going around, and especially if you're digitizing vigorously and going fast, it's not always going to hit that outside edge and the inside edge perfectly. It can get wobbly. So I tend to, any tools that you have in your software that kind of gives you that starting point where everything's even and centered and on point, and then you make your adjustments from there.
Okay.
Instead of trying to kind of go through it and kind of fighting against yourself and possibly doing it off and then having to make the adjustments later. So just a quick run through. I know we're running out of time here.
I mean, you've got 9 minutes. You're practically done, I think.
Practically done.
Yeah, you're pretty far.
My sequencing's off. That's bugging me. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take those W's, and this is
Get rid of them.
What's that?
I said get rid of them.
Let's do this. This here, and again, my screen may be set up differently than what it comes in the default in Wacom. I've just kind of moved. You can move menus around, and depending on how much I use them, and where you get used to where they're at, so you remember where to grab them. But up here, this is kind of your sequencing tool that when you grab elements, you can travel by. It sends it back one object or by color, send it all the way back to the start or back to the beginning. It's just a quick way of moving around elements. Or you can just grab them and drag and drop too. Yeah, W. There is caps here where the legs meet, which is good. The one thing I do see that the couple of the legs are traveling quite a bit under those caps. Okay. So it's 2 layers of stitching, really not needed for this. There may be times where you are really trying to go over an area that, on a really thick fleece or something like that you're trying to get different layers of satins to get coverage maybe, but lettering, I think you looking at the W, you really want to focus on trying to get the angles to be consistent, kind of like this one here, where this angle is not really matching up with the cap.
Gotcha.
So you can kind of go into those nodes, and really you got to just where one leg ends the cap or the other leg begins. You don't really have to do much overlap. I mean, where all the legs meet, you can do maybe a couple stitch overlap to make sure there's no gaps especially if there's traveling for underlay or something like that. But another thing, making sure that the sequence. Okay, so this W doing the center out technique. Right now it's digitized where it does start on the left side and works its way in. So if you've established that center of the hat and if you finish the center point and you've really stabilized that center of the hat, if you were to leave the W the way it is and now go to the outer part of the W and work your way in, I'd say 9 times out of 10 you're going to create a crease of that hat. Because what you're doing is you're kind of, that outside of that circle is now a little bit less stable than the center. If you go to the sewing field that's away from that circle, you have that gap of that lettering between the outer part of the W and the circle that you've established, and you're going to start sewing that outside, leaves that center part of that hat kind of free, kind of bubbles up. And you're going to push it right into that circle. So you definitely want to go
start from the right side.
Right.
Okay.
So one trick that sometimes, especially when it comes to lettering, sometimes I'll just go through and digitize all the shapes, and then I'll go back and sequence them later, depending on the font or what frame of mind I'm in at that night. But one thing you could do is selecting them, and if you use Control, if you hold down Control, as you click the elements, it's going to select them in that order. And then you can go up to your sequencing and say select sequence by selects, and now it's going to sequence them in that order.
I haven't checked I don't know if I don't know if I have that option in Hatch. If I don't, it'll just have to be manual. But
yeah. Again, these are just shortcuts. Pretty much everything. Yeah. All the shortcuts are 9 times out of 10. It's something that you can do manually. It's just a quick way of getting there.
So I'm going to grab a couple. Justin, I'm going to jump in.
What's that?
Suzanne says, so is this the same Dustin from the New Year's Eve with the bonfire? It absolutely is.
Yes, it is.
And Barb says the W bottom doesn't seem to be straight across. So if you drop a grid line running across the bottom of the 2 W's there.
Nope. You're absolutely right.
They're supposed to be? I think that in the art they were.
Yeah.
Cool.
So another thing in Wilcom, you have these guides that you can set, and you can snap to them. So when you are moving around nodes, it'll actually snap to that line. So if you want something perfectly even across the board and you have lettering that you want to be on the same plane, you drop a guide, snap your nodes to it, and it's going to be perfectly horizontal every time. So after I do the sequencing, I go through making sure my start and stops match up to each other. X being the stop, the green diamond being the start, or end and start.
So one thing to note here too is Justin is manually moving the start and the stops. In Wilcom, there is a option to do closest join, and it'll automatically try to do that for you. I'm pretty sure Justin turns his off, and I know I turned it off because I like to have more control. But
yeah,
that is something that it will try to do when you're digitizing, is it'll try to put your start and your stops as close as they can together.
I turn it off because it tends to, for whatever reason, instead of it stopping at the actual end of a satin and starting at the next part, there's a lot of times where it'll try to go back a couple stitches and end there. It does a couple weird things depending on how the 2 elements meet. It does some weird stuff sometimes. So I turn it off and just make sure that I'm at the very end of the design, especially, or section by section, I kind of go through and make sure that all my sequencing is right and the start and end points are lined up. And I see a question here.
Yeah, I was getting there. So we actually have a couple of questions. I'm going to grab this one here first. So Barb says, when would you just copy and paste the W to the right side of the O?
This particular W looks like it's symmetrical left and right. So yes, I would digitize one and not just copy and paste, because now you have left to right and right to left. So you're going to want to mirror it and flip it to make sure that that inner part of the W sews first on its way out. But yeah, I mean, if it was a weird font where, you know, the right side was thicker than the left side, you wouldn't be able to mirror it because then it'd be opposite. But something symmetrical like this, like an A or a W or an O or something like that, where you know it's the same mirrored horizontally, then yeah, you can definitely copy and paste.
All right. And Natalie says, is there a reason why the W is digitized in different sections?
Well, it's not a stock font, so it's not going to be all one piece. So there is a way of digitizing it if you want it one fluid motion where you kind of come down and you start the, if I were digitizing this, and you do get some overlap down at the bottom. If you stop there at the bottom and just keep on going your way up, the difference there is you do have that overlap in these sections where you're going to have stitches over each other. W this size going on a hat, I don't think it's going to be an issue. If this was a smaller letter, you don't want that many layers of stitches when you're already fighting against densities and underlays and stuff like that. You don't want these big stiff tips to letters on such a small area. Something like this, it very well would work fine.
That's all the questions so far. I mean, we got a couple of comments here. Gina says, thanks, guys. I wondered why the start and stop caught me or fight me at times. And that's one of the things that I've run into too. So I believe we're all caught up on comments, and we're getting pretty close here to the end too. We do have one more comment here. Oh, you got it. I have been a slow learner when it comes to Wilcon, but after lots of lives and classes, things are starting to make sense. Thank you. Awesome. I'm glad that it is.
So, Dustin, do you have any questions on things that I changed?
No. I think it all makes sense. Definitely huge learning curve. Just to kind of see properly how these are digitized. Again, I kind of graduated up from Chroma Inspire to Hatch, and granted I don't have the tools and the Wilcom tool that you have, but I have way more tools in Wilcom Hatch than I did in Inspire. So I've learned a lot, and of course every day is a learning, and so I just got to keep digitizing, and until I get good enough to invest in the higher up.
What I could suggest to you is especially if you're good with subbing your work out, if you have a relationship with the digitizer that you trust, that does good work, what I would suggest to you would be, send that design out and digitize it yourself. Compare, contrast, and also make sure you're on that machine and watching it sew from that digitizer, and hopefully you have the communication when you're the digitizer. If you see something done that you may have never thought of or kind of goes against what we show or what you've seen in the past, say, hey, is there any reason you did that, or was it just a brain freeze on their part that they forgot to change something? Or and there's times where, like Jeff said, those are kind of they're not steadfast rules where you have to do every single point to the letter. Kind of the guide of center out, bottom up is definitely the direction you want to go for hats. But there are times and there are designs that are going to force you to do something a little bit different, or kind of fudge that idea a little bit to make sure that it works for that particular design.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's really just, I mean, you did a phenomenal job going through a fairly simple design, but there's still a lot to learn to it. especially with layering and default shapes, how to utilize default shapes to your advantage, and just smaller fonts, because I know that's huge, and that's in a lot of a lot of people look at hats. To be honest with you, I'm starting to learn how to digitize, like I said, but hats, I know a lot of people kind of cringe when they, because they know the difficulties of. I love hats. I could do them all day, 24/7. I love
Yeah.
doing hats. So
I'm the same. I'm the same. And and a couple things too that you may want to come back to your customer, knowing that it's a design. You mentioned going on beanies. That there's small lettering on it. Their whole design doesn't have to be on every single garment. It doesn't have to be like if they're doing it on a sleeve or they're doing it on a weird placement or a beanie. You're gonna have that small lettering falling into the beanie. There's a couple ways of kind of combat that. You can kind of do the knockdown light fill underneath the design to try to flatten out that material before you put the small lettering. Honestly, I would tell them, hey, you got the small lettering on your polo shirts, on your hats. Let's just throw the wow on the beanies. It doesn't have to be it could be some variation of the design depending on what garments you're going on. Or if they decide to say, hey, I like that wow on the panel of the hat. I like the way that looks. Well, we can do that, but we're gonna have to get rid of your small lettering. Let's just do the wow. And again, you don't have to be a walking billboard with every single piece of information on every single placement the same. So those are just suggestions that you can go back to your customer and kind of steer them in the right direction so they have the best possible outcome with their garments.
Yeah. And this customer I actually used to work for a while. So they came to me knowing that I said, I can digitize. And that was back in my days when I used to climb 400 or 500 foot towers, which I don't anymore. So
no thanks. Crystal says here, Eric says coordinate, don't replicate. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So just want to make sure that no more questions are coming in.
No, and I don't see any either. So I think you've pretty much, you've covered a lot already in the hour that we've been here. And again, if you guys are looking for more and you want to find out more about texts, all of that fun stuff, let me click on the little, I've got all the buttons. You can definitely sign up for Justin's webinar. It's embnerd.com/text talk. Digitizing is a significant amount of text most of the time. So it's really important that you get your text right. So I highly recommend that. And other than that, I'm pretty sure that's covered everything. So I'll go ahead and close this out unless you have anything else.
No, I think that's it. It's good having you, Dustin. I had fun.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Justin. This was a great opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Yep, happy to do it. And
Yeah.
so with that, we have Dustin from Lilac City Stitches. We have Justin from JA Digitizing Studios, and I'm Jeff Fuller from Fuller Embroidery Works, and we are all here representing the Embroidery Nerd. I'd like to thank you guys for your time, and we'll talk to you later.
Good night, guys.